Good morning and welcome to the 2022 Ohio Grape Wine Conference. Thank you for joining the Viticulture session this morning. Today, I would like to share with you a research update on our variety evaluation trials. First, I'd like to give you a quick background about this project. So variety evaluation has been identified as a research priority by our industry. And actually, this has become even more critical in recent years because of the availability of so many new varieties in the market, either through nurseries or breeding programs. So actually, this is really a good time for our grape and wine producer to plant new varieties because there are so many ones available now beyond the traditional varieties that we know of. So since variety performance is site specific, it is very important that we test these new varieties here in Ohio. And that is actually the first objective of this project is to first acquire these varieties, plant them, and then evaluate their performance in the vineyard as well as their wine potential. Our second objective is to provide recommendation of the best performers and identify the pros and cons of each of these varieties. And then finally, ultimately, our long-term goal is to identify what we call terroirs of these varieties, basically finding the best match between the variety and the region, which is finding out the region that where these grapes thrive, both in the vineyard as well as in the winery. So first, I would like to discuss the weather of 2021. And one of the parameters that we look at is the growing degree days or heat units, which measure the warmth of the season. This graph here shows monthly growing degree days, and it represents 3 years. The black bars here represent 2021. The red is the 2020. And then the gray actually is the 30-year average between 1982 and 2011. So even though these growing degree days were measured in the Wooster location, even though this is specific to this location, actually some of the trends could be or were seen or were observed across the state of Ohio. And I'd like to share with you some of this observation. First, we noted early on in the season, during early spring, warmer than normal or more growing degree days. And basically what this resulted in early bud break. Unfortunately, we had the late spring frost late in April, which caused damage in many regions in Ohio, especially in central and southern Ohio. We were fortunate in our research location. We didn't see much damage because we didn't reach killing temperatures from this frost. The other thing that I also like to point out is we also saw more growing degree days or warmer than normal month of June. This month is kind of critical because this is when most of the bloom occurs in the state. And warmer than normal condition means we had likely better fruit set, which results in better crop at the end of the season. Also, at the end of the season, we observed a warmer than normal ripening period during the month of August, September, and October. And again, this warmth indicates that we have ideal condition for ripening of the fruit, especially those that ripen late in the season. This graph represents the total of the growing degree days. So basically, we sum up the growing degree days throughout the growing season. And here represents the total at the end of the season. And as you could see, 2021 had the highest amounts at 3,270, much higher than the season 2020, and also much higher than the average, the 30-year average. So this number, or the total growing degree days, give us an idea about whether we will be able to ripen certain varieties or not in our in specific locations. And then typically when we reach amounts higher than 3,000, between 3,000 and 3,500, we should be able to ripen most of varieties. The map here shows the location of the trial here in Wooster in northeast Ohio. And a couple of things I'd like to point out. First is what I call the growing degree days. The older growing accumulation of growing degree days. 20 years ago, we used to accumulate around 2,700 growing degree days. Now, as shown in 2021, much higher number. So this is again an indication of the climate change and the warming of the growing season as measured by the growing degree days. Second, I'd like to point out when we compare our site to the research vineyard at the Ashtabula Agriculture Research Station, last year, which is unusual, Kingsville accumulated more growing degree days than Worcester, which is typically not the case. So that means even at the coolest location of the state, we had enough growing degree days to ripen the most or the latest varieties like Cabernet Franc. The second parameter that we also measure is monthly precipitation. And again, we saw some trends, drier early in the spring and summer. And then also we saw the month of June again, bloom time drier than normal. So the combination of warmer and drier month of June resulted in ideal condition for bloom and fruit set, which means better crop at the end of the season. And then during the ripening, again, we saw drier than normal ripening season, which means we had less disease pressure, meaning we had cleaner fruit during harvest. So description of the two blocks. First of all, I'd like to discuss the cold tender variety. Again, this is located in Worcester. Most of the varieties here are Vitis vinifera, and the spacing is 6 by 9, which is typical for a commercial vineyard. Training system, what we call the low bilateral cordon or VSP, and all these vines were spur pruned. These are the names of the 21 varieties that we first established back in 2016. So we had equal amount of whites and red varieties. So typically with variety evaluation, these are long-term projects. It takes about a minimum of 8 years. The first 4 years, these are what we call establishing years. And then the following 4 years is when we collect data. Sometimes early on during the establishing years, we start to see some varieties that underperform. And in this case, these varieties are highlighted in red. And primarily, the main reason for underperforming has to do with cold hardness. And so these varieties were a little bit too tender for our location. And for those reasons, we removed these varieties and we planted them with new ones. This is an example of these varieties of Vitis vinifera. We try to find a good selection of both what we call cool climate varieties. So hopefully those will be more suitable for northern Ohio. And then also, so a lot of these varieties come from countries like Italy, France, and Germany. And then we also have warm climate varieties. Hopefully these will be suitable for southern Ohio. And these varieties typically are from southern countries in Europe, like Spain, for example, Albarino and Verdejo, and then also even Portugal, like Verdelho. The other block, what we call cold hardy varieties, these are all hybrids. Again, this is in Worcester. Since these are hybrids, we planted them at a wider spacing of 7 foot between the vines. And typically hybrids, they like to grow downward. So we train these as a high bilateral or high cordon training system. And all these varieties were spur prone. In these hybrid blocks, we have subgroups. The first one, what we call the Minnesota variety or selections. Typically, these are numbered selections. Either they have been recently released, like Itasca used to be called Minnesota 1285, or about to be released like the Minnesota 1220, which you guys had the chance to taste yesterday, provided by John Toole from University of Minnesota. And then we have many of these selections, either reds or whites, and with these numbers. The other group, what we call Tom Plucker varieties, again, these are cold hardy varieties. Some of these actually are becoming popular, like Petite Pearl, Crimson Pearl, and Verona. And also we have some numbered selection provided by Tom Plucker, TP1112 and TP2351. In this same hybrid block, also we included recently, the last couple of years, New York selection. These are provided from Cornell University by Dr. Bruce Reich. And we planted 6 varieties, and we had some varieties that started producing last year, only 3 selections produced in 2021. In terms of vineyard management, we apply what we call the best viticulture practices, including balanced pruning and all canopy management practices, including suckering, shoot thinning, shoot positioning, cluster thinning, leaf pulling, and hedging. We follow the same pest management as in commercial vineyards. And then finally, close to harvest, we apply nets to protect from birds. These are our observation in 2021, what I call our usual suspects. We have a little bit more what I call a major issue, more than normal issues or infestation from Japanese beetles. And then also near harvest, we have more than normal presence of yellow jackets and hornets. In terms of what I call minor issues, a little bit of downy mildew at the end of the season. This is actually observed after harvest, and to protect the canopy after harvest, we had to spray for downy mildew to make sure that the vines don't get defoliated. We saw also less than normal sour rot, and then in terms of wildlife, very minimum impact because of our practices of applying nets, as well as these electric fans to protect against raccoon. So one of the first data that we collect, we call phenology, and one of the key stages of development is bud break. So this data represents dates of bud break of all these varieties of Vitis vinifera. So the first observation is all of our bud break occurred much earlier than normal, almost 2 weeks earlier than normal, ranging between mid-April and the end of April. So these varieties actually are ranked from earliest bud break to the latest bud break. So again, you could see some of the what we call early bud breaking varieties like Albarino, Hardness compared to the Chardonnay, which is considered an early variety. And then we have later varieties like Sauvignon Blanc and Touquet, Friulano, and Touriga Brasiliana. The other thing that we collect in terms of phenology is maturity or fruit maturity, as we express by harvest date and the corresponding growing degree days. So this represents varieties from the earliest harvest to the latest. So we begin to pick grapes in the first week of September all the way to mid-October. So a couple of observations. There are a couple of varieties that ripen in the first week of September, like Trousseau and Regent. For us, this is kind of a little bit early. So definitely these varieties will be a concern or a question mark, if they are planted in a more southern latitude, like in central and southern Ohio, because it means they will be ripening in August, which is one of the warmest months. And typically that is not desirable because of the impact on the quality of the fruit and likely on the quality of the wines as well. The remaining of the varieties, they ripen mid-season, which is ideal. And then finally, our latest varieties ripen by mid-October, like Cabernet Franc and Petit Mansang. So we were able to ripen all these varieties in our location. I indicated here as a footnote the killing frost in Worcester, which is the 3rd of November, which means that we still have season after our latest variety being picked. That means the vines have the chance to harden off after harvest, which is ideal conditions. Other data that we collect are the yield components, and I like to pay attention to this column here. It represents what we call the equivalent yield, represented or expressed as tons per acre. First, we were able to have a full crop for the first time in 2021. These yields actually are what we call target yields, or we targeted them early on by doing a cluster thinning. For reds, we target 3 to 4 tons to the acre, and with whites, we target 5 to 6 tons. And in most cases, we were able to achieve those yields. The last column, this is bunch rat, and bunch rat includes all kind of rat, mainly sour rat in this case. And as you could see, there are differences between varieties. Some are more resistant, like with zero bunch rat, like Albarino, Chardonnay clone 37, Petit Mansang, and Verdelho. Others, like Sauvignon Blanc here, you could see also differences between the clones. Clone 1 being the worst at 40%, and the clone that we recommend, 27, has manageable or decent bunch rat. And some new varieties actually are very susceptible to bunch rat, like Trousseau, with levels nearly 70%. We also collect data on fruit composition. And in 2021, actually, we had a very nice fruit composition, what we call balanced fruit composition in terms of sugars, pH, and TA. The pH actually were all within the optimum range, and the same thing with the acidity, were all under a 10 or under 10 and considered to be optimum. We also measure fruit maturity through this fruit maturity index, and typically we like to see our fruit reaching levels of 20. And as you could see, all of this variety reach that threshold, or even have higher fruit maturity, reaching 30 or values near 40 as well. Now discussing the hybrid block in terms of bud break, say a similar observation like vinifera, some early than normal bud break. Some of these earlier, little bit of concern, but some of these new selections with early bud break here, Minnesota 1220, 1280, the new variety Brianna, Itasca, and 1241. So this is a little bit of concern, especially in sites where you have spring frost issues. This could be of a concern. And then we have later bud breaking varieties like the Minnesota 1256, Petit Pearl, and Frontenac Blanc. In terms of harvest date, similar observation. Our earliest was in August, and our latest was 12 of October. So we have a span of almost 2 months of harvest. Again, same observation. The early varieties, this is not desirable, like Brianna and Itasca, ripening the first week of September, meaning that these varieties in more southern latitude, like in central or southern Ohio, they will be ripening in August, which is not desirable. A lot of these varieties, however, ripen in mid-season, which is ideal, including the New York selections and the Minnesota and the Tom Plucker selections. So again, we were able to ripen all of these hybrids in our location before our killing frost. In terms of yields, these being hybrids, they have a much higher yield than vinifera. So we didn't have necessarily what I call a target yield, because a lot of these varieties really are new, or they are new selections. So we have no way to know what is the target yield. So what we end up doing is we cluster thing to no more than 2 clusters per shoot. And even with that, we still had the yields in excess of 6 tons, like Brianna 9 tons, and even with the 1280, we had yields of 11 tons to the acre. Same thing in terms of bunch rot. Overall, these hybrids performed very well with very little bunch rot, with the exception of Itasca, close to 60%. Fruit composition also very nicely balanced fruit composition in terms of sugars, pH, and TA. One of the, here in terms of sugar or bricks, Brianna was lower than normal, and this is actually on purpose. We picked this variety early on at 16.5, and one of the reasons is we didn't want the Labrusca flavor to develop, so we picked this variety early on. This is a similar practice as is done by wineries with Cayuga White, where they pick that variety earlier, like at 15 bricks, for similar reasons. The other observations, we noticed that a lot of these new selections from Minnesota actually have decent acidity at 10 or lower TA. So, for example, compared to the traditional varieties like Frontenac Blanc here at 13.2, which is very high. However, the new selections have more manageable acidity, which is a good thing to see. The same thing with the New York selections. All of them produce decent acidity, as well as the Tom Plucker variety and selection. In terms of the fruit maturity index, again, we were able to achieve the minimum threshold of 20, and some of them were reached even a higher level at the 30 level. So fruit composition was ideal again for 2021. Finally, cold hardness. This is a very important aspect of our research, since cold is one of the major limiting factors for grape production here in Ohio. So we measure cold hardness in the lab, and this is actually a cold hardness measured back in December of all these varieties combined. And as predicted or as expected, the vinifera varieties had the lowest cold hardness measured by the LT50, ranging from -4 to -8, and then followed by the New York hybrids with cold hardness between -10 and -14. And then, as expected, the Minnesota hybrid were the most cold hardy, with the LT50 ranging between -14 and -16. So in summary, and again, these are preliminary results. We are still collecting the data. Some of these vines are still young, between third year and fourth year. However, we start to see some promising variety within the cold tender block: Albarino, Verdelho, Verdejo, Tokay Friulano, Petit Mensang, Touriga, and Touriga Brasiliara. For the cold hardy varieties, again, still too early to tell. We have only 1 year of crop, but some promising new selection: the Minnesota 1220, MN 1241, Crimson Pearl, Petit Pearl, and TP 2351. With that, I would like to conclude by thanking the Ohio grape industry for funding this project, and a big thank you to all members of my group for their assistance in this project. Thank you very much for your attention.